All right, it's another film study. It's Know Your Foe time. Ken, are you doing?
Life's good, Josh. How about you?
I'm all good. I feel like I keep talking about referencing Sunday night for Ravens, even though they play on Monday on 1 o'clock games. But we finally get an evening game to talk about this week.
There you go. As an analyst, I absolutely hate evening games. It really throws off my schedule for going through the film and doing what I need to do. But I know a lot of people like prime time, just not me.
Well, yeah, and I got to arrange my work schedule for Mondays. So after these games, to make sure I have no early morning meetings, because sometimes these games do go too late in the evening. But let's get our guest on. We've got Mark Schofield from the Touchdown Wire at USA Today. Mark, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Josh. Ken, it's great to be with you guys again. We had a lot of fun last year when we did this, and I've been looking forward to this one pretty much all year long. So I'm excited to be here.
You got a lifetime invitation. I'll tell you that right now, Mark. Great content and football. For people who are not following Mark on Twitter, it's just at Mark Schofield, right?
That's right.
And you get a quarterback guru, a guy who puts out a lot of interesting little eye candy clips with some great analysis to go with that. Highly recommended follower. And he's been one of the guys who's been very supportive of the show in terms of getting good guests on with us from other teams. So I really appreciate that, Mark.
Well, I'm happy to send good people your way. Ken, I'm such a huge fan of this show and what you're doing. And, it's been great to see, your work and your website and the stuff you do start to grow so much. And I'm so happy to see that.
I appreciate it, Mark. Thanks. Well, let's get to talking about this game because it's a big deal for Ravens fans anytime they get to play the Patriots. Patriots obviously not having the year that you probably would have hoped for.
No, they haven't. It has been certainly a bit of a transition year, Ken. And I think in a way that was to be expected once Tom Brady decided that he was going to leave for the South and head to Tampa Bay. There were some moments earlier in this season. I think that week 2 game against Seattle when you thought, well, maybe they have something here on offense. Maybe they have something here of a vertical passing game. And I think what we learned that night more than anything else was that Seattle's defense is bad. It wasn't so much that New England's passing game is good. The Seattle secondary isn't great. So they're 3-5 right now. They're at sort of, I'd say, a tipping point over the next couple of weeks as to how they'll approach sort of the stretch drive here, which is why this game Sunday night is massive from New England's perspective.
Yeah, obviously a big one for the Ravens as well. They definitely cannot afford to look past it. They're in a tough stretch of games. Honestly, they probably make the playoffs regardless of what happens the next 3 games, but seeding is important, and they will lose opportunity for that if they are not careful here and take each of these games one at a time. Ravens obviously have had their problems this year, but I want to go back to the offseason for the Patriots because maybe one of the biggest things that happened this offseason was the very large COVID opt-out list that the Patriots presented. And obviously, the way I've stated it on Baltimore radio is that you'd have to pretty much be a rookie on earth to believe Belichick's not behind that in some way.
Yeah, I will tell you, Ken, when those names were announced, particularly Dante Hightower, and Patrick Chung, there were a lot of people that thought Belichick's punted on 2020. This is a sign that he's looking at the landscape, looking at his first post-Tom Brady season. He's looking around the AFC, and he's realized this is an opportunity to sort of reset things over 2020. We'll have a ton of cap space in 2021. Let's punt on the entire year. And guys, just let me know up front, if you're even thinking about sitting out, if you're wary, lean towards sitting out. There are a lot of people that think that way. And certainly anytime Bill Belichick does something from a personnel standpoint, that's instantly where your mind goes. And there may be some truth to that. But the opt-outs certainly have set them on a course where their defense, which was a strength going into this season, now might be the biggest question mark. You talk to anybody that covers this team, Matt Chatham, who played for this team, who covers this team for The Athletic in Boston. He's been talking for weeks how the Patriots defense is a problem. It was a problem Monday night. It was a problem against the 49ers a couple of weeks ago. And it's going to be a problem if they don't get that figured out. But we're 8 games in. And those opt-outs and some injuries, they're really taking a toll on that defense.
Yeah, so I do want to get back to the dearth now that exists on the Patriots at linebacker, inside linebacker, and on the defensive line in particular. But let's talk about the offseason a little bit more first. And the acquisitions that occurred, so Cam Newton, probably the biggest acquisition in the offseason. Who else did they acquire? And what's been their impact on the Patriots so far?
Well, I think obviously you start with Cam Newton. That's the big one. That was sort of the lightning bolt at the end of free agency. A lot of people, myself included, had started to really talk ourselves into Jarrett Stidham as being the plan, taking 2020 to evaluate him. And then they went out and they got a deal done with Cam Newton. But I think Damiere Byrd, the wide receiver who had spent some time in Carolina with Cam Newton, that acquisition has become a bigger part of this offense, particularly over the past couple of weeks. Injuries to N'Keal Harry and Julian Edelman, and a sort of shift towards a strictly 21 personnel team for the most part with two wide receivers. It's Jacoby Myers and Damiere Byrd, and Byrd has basically been a starter since week one. It was an under the radar signing, but you could certainly tell between Cam Newton and Damiere Byrd, there is a familiarity. They're on the same page. There's feel for each other, and it's feel for a receiver that Cam Newton doesn't have with anybody else on this roster. You look at that San Francisco game a couple of weeks ago, there was an interception where Edelman and Newton were not on the same page on a basic route concept, Haas Juke, which is a day one install in New England. That's the play they ran three straight times in the Super Bowl against the Los Angeles Rams a couple of years ago. That's something where you have to have that feel, that same wavelength between quarterback and receiver. It's not there between Newton and Edelman, hasn't been there with some of the other receivers. It's certainly been there all season long between Newton and Damiere Byrd. So I think Byrd is sort of one of those underrated sign-ins that has been a big part of this team right now.
Jacoby Myers, I'm a little surprised you don't mention him kind of in the same breath with a player like Byrd because of what he's basically done these last few weeks at least. Tell us a little bit about why he's not in that same class in terms of being on the same page, maybe with Newton.
Well, there's a trust level between Newton and Jacoby Myers. Myers has been an interesting player. Obviously, last year when they drafted N'Keal Harry in the first round, Jacoby Myers was an undrafted rookie free agent last year, a quarterback position switch while he was at NC State. And so there were a lot of people that were sort of putting all their eggs in the N'Keal Harry basket. But even last year, Myers, due to injury, had to see some playing time. And you could see that there's something to this kid. And it's that quarterback background that he has. So he has an understanding of how route concepts work and how coverage works from a quarterback's perspective. And, with the Byrd acquisition, trying to get more opportunities from N'Keal Harry, obviously with Julian Edelman, and the fact that they were more of a 21-2 running back team at the start of this year, Myers was again sort of on the outside looking in. But with Harry's injury, Edelman's injury, now you're seeing Myers press back into action. And he is certainly on that same page with Cam Newton. You saw that on Monday night. Anytime Monday night they needed a big play against the Jets, Cam Newton was looking to Jacoby Myers. Yeah. And, the 2018 version of me, if you went back and told me that, in a couple of years, Cam Newton's going to be trusting Jacoby Myers on a 3rd and 20 on a Monday night football game, I'd have thought you were crazy. But that's where we're at right now. And so Damiere Byrd was a huge acquisition in the offseason. But, signing Jacoby Myers after last year's draft as an undrafted free agent might be one of the better wide receiver moves that the Patriots have made in a long time, to be honest.
Anytime you can get a UDFA value like that, it's remarkable. And, it's always necessity that is kind of the mother of some of these great breakouts. But he's caught 22 out of 28 balls the last 3 weeks. And, that's that in and of itself, that's a number one receiver kind of level. And he's done it for really good yardage as well. So in terms of development hopes, that's probably the next place I want to talk, in part because I know the Patriots are looking to next year probably more than they're looking to this year at this point. And I don't want to, put down the Patriots, but their 3rd and 4th year players in particular. Talk a little bit about them and what the plans might be, given the Patriots have some cap to spend.
Yeah, I think a good place to start would probably be Dietrich Wise, Derek Rivers, two of their guys from that 17 class. Rivers was a 3rd round pick, Dietrich Wise a 4th round pick. And Derek Rivers was somebody that a lot of people liked in his draft class. coming out of Youngstown State. A lot of people liked what he did at the Senior Bowl. I had a good chance to see him. I did get a chance to see him at the Senior Bowl, and you could see the quick hands, the athleticism. There were questions about whether that would translate to the NFL coming from an FCS school, and he showed that Senior Bowl week that he belonged at the next level. But then he had some injuries, and it didn't quite come together for him. But Bill Belichick was very complimentary of the way Rivers approached this, the most recent offseason and training camp period. He spoke glowingly about how Rivers added some weight, added some strength and some speed. And so he's made a couple of big plays for them this year, had a big pressure on Joe Flacco on Monday night. And then Dietrich Wise, who was kind of the afterthought after they had drafted Rivers, he had more of a role the past couple of seasons as a guy up front for them. And those two, particularly with the absence of Lawrence Guy, last week, have had to step up a bit up front for them on the defensive side of the ball. So that's a good place to start, those two players. If you want to look offensively, I think you sort of have to look Joe Tooney, who's been a rock for them at the left guard spot. Remember that 2016 class. Certainly a player that they count on. He was a free agent this offseason, but they got a deal done with him. The offensive line might be the best core unit of this entire team on both sides of the ball. They're starting to piece together a group that they like. I think, Michael Onwenu, who's a rookie out of Michigan.
Yeah.
They really like him a lot. I know we're going to talk about him in a little bit, so I won't say too much there, but they've used him right tackle, right guard, left tackle. They've used him all over up front. They've had to mix and match at times. David Andrews, their center, was out. You had to move Joe Tooney to center. But Joe Tooney, I think, is another in that sort of like 3 to 4 year range of a guy that is a core part of this team, both in the present and in the sort of short and long term going forward.
Okay, so J.C. Jackson is another player who's was he a first-round draft pick originally? No, he wasn't.
No, he wasn't. J.C. Jackson was and unless I'm missing it, he was an
UFA.
undrafted free agent.
Yeah,
they've had some success, Ken, over the years in that UDFA range. Malcolm Butler obviously was one out of Alabama State. Now he's obviously with the Tennessee Titans, but made one of the biggest plays in Super Bowl history. The same thing with J.C. Jackson, an undrafted free agent, local kid too. But they really sort of liked him, local to Maryland. And so, he's had to step up in the absence of Stephon Gilmore. And even though he made some bad plays, had some bad moments Monday night, J.C. Jackson is a player that maybe in 2022 other locker rooms is probably a CB1. It's
right.
Just because they have Stephon Gilmore and we know what he can do as a corner. He's had to play more of that CB2 type of role, although he stepped out of that shadow the past couple of weeks and had the big interception on Monday night of Joe Flacco.
So you're the GM for the Patriots. Is Jackson a guy you try and extend this offseason? He'll be done with 3 years going into RFA year. Seems like a natural time to get him extended for maybe 3 years if you could.
I think so, Ken. I think that's the priority between, getting sort of a long-term deal done with Stephon Gilmore or J.C. Jackson. I'm going with J.C. Jackson. There are a lot of people, and I would have put myself in this camp, that thought if the Patriots were going to be sellers at the trade deadline last week, that Stephon Gilmore would be the player they would move. Obviously, there's a higher salary there. You could free up a bit more cap space if you move Stephon Gilmore as opposed to a J.C. Jackson. And look, J.C. Jackson's just 25. And so this might be, like you said, the time he's entering that RFA year to get a long-term deal done with him. I heard, Diane Rossini and others saying that, look, they were looking for a first-round pick for Stephon Gilmore. Maybe teams wouldn't be willing to pay that. I think eventually somebody would. So I think they could get a good return for Stephon Gilmore. And given the depth that they have in the secondary, although some of the guys haven't panned out immediately like they would have hoped, I think Stephon Gilmore is the guy that they would move. J.C. Jackson is the guy you keep in-house.
All right. J.C. Jackson has an interesting connection to the Ravens here because he's now, and I got to get this right, I think it's 4th all-time in adjusted interceptions per 16 games of guys who have 15 or more career interceptions. And I think he has 17 now. I might be slightly wrong. But he's one of the only 4 people that are ahead of Ed Reed. And Marcus Peters was number 1 on that list, but another player moved in, Miami, Xavier Howard, just moved in with over 15 interceptions. So anyway, that group is remarkable in terms of their interception rates, and those are the guys that are now ahead of Reed. I look at it as a player like Jackson is hitting like 420, going for a 400. If Ed Reed's career 7.5 interceptions adjusted basis is hitting 400 on a full season, he's hitting 410 on May the 10th. And Peters is hitting 425 on July at the All-Star break, let's say. Let's simplify this analogy.
Yep, that makes sense. Yep.
Okay, so let's go back. The draft is the next thing I want to talk about. Kyle Duggar, a lot of people had him in different places in terms of where he'd be drafted. Going in the second round, I think, is a little higher than some people thought, but still, tell us about him.
In many ways, this was both the quintessential Belichick pick and a departure from the quintessential Belichick pick. I said on Twitter and elsewhere before the draft that, everybody's expecting Belichick. Maybe he takes a quarterback. Maybe he does something different. He's going to take a safety. That's Bill Belichick. He's going to draft some random safety. Everybody should prepare themselves for that. And that's what they did. They drafted Kyle Duggar, a kid from Lenore Ryan, a Division II school. So it's sort of the quintessential Belichick pick in that they drafted defense. They drafted a secondary player. They drafted somebody that's a little bit outside of the norm. But where I think it was a bit of a departure from that quintessential Belichick selection is that there were some other players in this draft class, say Xavier McKinney, if they wanted to go safety, that might have been your traditional Belichick selection, a guy from Alabama. There's the Saban Belichick connection. Somebody that has run a system that you could drop him into New England's, first day of training camp, and he knows the playbook. There's a lot of overlap between what Belichick runs and what Saban runs down at Alabama. And so you would have thought he would have gone in that direction, but instead he bet a bit on athleticism. You see Kyle Duggar down in Mobile at the Senior Bowl. Then we get to see him out in Indianapolis at the Combine. And this guy showed he belonged down in Mobile, where he and Jeremy Chin, Jeremy Chin obviously was drafted by the Carolina Panthers. Those two guys stood out the entire week. When you saw the ball, those guys were right near it no matter what was happening. So those guys both really impressed me. And then both of them went to Indianapolis. And as they say, they tested out of the gym. And so where normally Belichick makes that bet on a guy that's a smart player, special teams, 3-year captain, maybe doesn't test that well, but you're betting on the mind. No, he went in a different direction. He bet on the athleticism. And so while it was in part a quintessential Belichick pick by picking a safety when everybody wanted to do something else, he also made that bet on athleticism. Now, that hasn't panned out the way people would have liked. He was being used more often early in the season. Now the snaps have kind of dwindled a little bit. There was a time that they thought, he might be sort of the tight end eraser type, and that hasn't quite panned out. But this was supposed to be a gap year, a year where he was going to caddy for Patrick Chung and carry the clubs for a season, and then perhaps take on a bigger role if they moved away from Patrick Chung in this upcoming offseason. Instead, he's had to play a lot more than they expected, probably more than they hoped for, and there's been a bit of an adjustment. But I think in the long term, they're going to be glad that they picked him because there is that athleticism, which I think will translate well to the field.
That's interesting. All interesting stuff, but I'm really perked up my ears on Xavier McKinney because he was one of 4 players that I thought the Ravens might do very well with in the first round at number 28. And the first guy I wanted was long gone, and that was the lineman Javon Kinlaw. But the others, McKinney would have been next. Delpit would have been okay one as well, and Epinesa was the last one on the list for me. But they took Patrick Queen. I think they got decent value on Queen. It's just I don't really believe in spending a lot of draft capital at inside linebacker. McKinney to me would have been a great pick. He went at 36 to the Giants. So I guess Belichick might have had to move up a spot to get him or do something, but we still I guess won't know if McKinney was his first choice or his second relative to Duggar.
Yeah, we won't. Every time I did a mock draft, when I had the idea of putting McKinney in the first round, I kept saying, Belichick might trade out of the first, which they did. They traded out of the first and the Chargers came up. But maybe he comes back in at the end of the first round to draft Xavier McKinney. Turns out that's what the Giants did, and then he got hurt. Maybe we might see him return to practice. That's kind of what we're hearing, that Xavier McKinney might come back. But I'm with you. I thought he was sort of a quintessential New England Patriot.
Yeah. Now, Josh Uche, another guy who has been, came with the reputation as a very technical pass rusher out of school. But how has that worked out at New England?
It's been up and down at times. There were some injury issues, and it took a while to get him on the field. He's sort of that tweener type. When he was down at Mobile, he showed you can give that pass rush off the edge. He also showed that on film at Michigan. They've carved out some opportunities for him in the past couple of weeks, and he's flashed some pass rush, and they're going to need that. That's still a question mark for this defense right now. You saw that Monday night against the Jets. There were times where Joe Flacco had all day to throw. They really need to figure out a way to get pressure on opposing quarterbacks. They've typically been a team that tries to get blitzes and stunts and cover zero blitz stuff and just overwhelm you with numbers. And even that hasn't really worked. They've still shown an inability to consistently get pressure. They'd like to see more from Josh Uche. I think with more time and more reps, he might give them what they want, but I'm not sure he's going to get that figured out by, say, Sunday night at 8 p.m.
Oh, okay. That's fine. Anytime after that would be fine.
Yeah, right.
He's like, obviously, he was highly thought of by some people here in Baltimore. The guy I really love, though, is the next guy on the list here, Michael Oweno. You guys getting him at 182 just breaks my heart. And especially, I watched a lot of film of the Michigan lineman. A lot of people in Baltimore wanted Ruiz. I thought he's way overvalued to be in the first round. Way overvalued. I loved him between 45 and 60. I hated him at 28. Let's put it that way. Bredesen, the left guard, very intelligent guy, probably will play center in the NFL because at his arm length, that's really the only thing that'll work. But Oweno was the guy I really loved of the three. And for the Ravens to get Bredesen at 143 and you guys to get Oweno at 182 just absolutely crushes me.
I mean, something about Michigan football players in the 6th round for New England, I guess, right? I mean, look, there were a lot of people that I talked to out in Indianapolis that said, yeah, look, Ruiz is great. Bredesen, he's going to be a day 3 pick and he might, find his way to a starting lineup at some point. But keep an eye on, this kid because he can play anywhere. He's got athleticism. He's got power. He's got fantastic hands. He's got a great second step, which is so critical to offensive line play. And, as they've needed to sort of patch things together up front with some injuries and opt-outs and things like that, they've basically used him as plug and play. He's basically their starting right tackle, but he's seen time at right guard. He's seen time at left guard. They've basically moved him around, and everywhere he's been solid. And I'm looking at this kid now as this is the cornerstone of their offensive line for the next 10 years between Isaiah Wynn at left tackle and him at right tackle. You've got your bookend tackles for the next 10 years. So you've at least figured that out. Now, maybe there's a chance that they feel his best spot is right guard. Shaq Mason has been a bit up and down. But either way, look, when they've got those two guys, those two sort of cornerstone type pieces set for the next, say 8 to 10 years.
Yeah, it's to me he's a remarkable find, and again one of the real steals of the draft. And somehow the Patriots seem to do it with less draft capital than most teams in most years because of their playoff position has always set them back a little bit in terms of draft capital, but they still have come out with great selections. So I'm just jealous as hell here.
Yeah, he's going to be a good one. He already is a good one.
Yeah, there you go. Let's move over to the offense here a little bit. What do you see being Newton's future? Is he a 1-year stopgap player, or will he be around for next year?
If you would ask me that, say 3 weeks ago, I would have said, they'll probably find a way to get a short-term extension done, perhaps 2 years with a team option or something like that, 1 year with a team option. And I might still sort of be there with that. But I think the idea that he's the 4 or 5 year answer at the quarterback position is probably dwindling away. While he's been better the past 2 weeks, I think there's an inconsistency to Cam Newton that is probably making it, less likely that he's going to be the guy. I would not be surprised at all. You're hearing people already say, look, they might have to go quarterback in the first round. It wouldn't surprise me at all if that's what they decide to do, especially if this season ends where some people would like it to end with them, 4-12 or something like that, where they actually get a chance to, like you just said, Ken, actually have an early pick and use some draft capital and invest it in the quarterback position because they haven't had a need to do that, let alone the opportunity to do that in 2 decades, during that Tom Brady run.
Yeah, it really doesn't come along very often.
It doesn't come along that often. And so, I that's why I think many are of the mind that if they do have that kind of finish, you take advantage of the opportunity that presents. And maybe you draft a quarterback, but you still think, look, we'll bring them along slowly while we have Cam Newton. I think like I said, Kim's been better the past couple of weeks, but there's an inconsistency to the passing game that I think is frustrating Patriots fans right now because they're so used to, and yes, we can say it, they've been spoiled for 20 years of Tom Brady, that when you have things like, poor ball placement at times, and throws that don't allow for yardage after the catch and things like that. People are like, what is happening here? And it's like, well, that's how the rest of the world's been living for the past 20 years, guys. Like, this is how you sometimes see the quarterback position played. I do think that, like I said, he's gotten better the past 2 weeks. I think he was 45 of 62 for 448 over those past 2 games. No touchdowns, but no interceptions, and also 19 carries for 70 yards and 3 touchdowns over that 2-game stretch. They had a chance to beat Buffalo at the end. He fumbled that one away when he was trying to make an athletic play, which one of those things where you hate to see it, but you understand it because he's trying to make an athletic play. So I don't think he's the long-term answer. He might be around here for another couple of years. It hasn't been the great success that many hoped it would be, but it hasn't been a catastrophic failure that some predicted it would be.
All right, obviously we ate some of our dessert first, and for me that's the offensive line play and talking about that. But take us through the offensive line player by player from window, Wayno, and who's there now among the starters.
Yeah, I mean, I think they've settled on. They've had multiple combinations, multiple iterations of the starting offensive line, but they've settled right now. We've got Wynn at left tackle, Joe Tooney at left guard, David Andrews at center, Shaq Mason right guard, and Michael Wenu at right tackle. Wynn, there were a lot of people that had questions whether he could play left tackle, even play tackle period because of the arm length, but he showed with footwork and technique, he's gotten better at playing that position. He's gotten beat up at times. Bradley Chubb in that Denver Broncos game had a really bad sack. Well, Chubb had a great sack. Wynn had a really bad rep against him where he just got blasted into Cam Newton's back. So there's been some up and down, but for the most part, Wynn has been solid. He's athletic. They love to run power toss with him getting in front. This is a running football team right now. And they love to run power toss, that crack toss with the receiver cracking to the inside, getting the tackle out in front of that. And they'd love to do that with Wynn. That's where they use his athleticism to get him in space a bit. We talked about Joe Tooney a little bit, but he's sort of a rock at the left guard spot. Technically sound, doesn't give up much in terms of pass rush, whether it's a bull rush technique on the inside or if you bring down linebackers in the A gap and try to use speed against him, he handles his own there. David Andrews, the center, another very solid player. They certainly missed him last year because he's sort of the captain of this group, and they missed him at times this year when he was out with an early hand injury, but he's back now. Very smart player. You saw some of that process and speed on Monday night. There was a big run from Damian Harris when the Jets brought a double A gap blitz, and he saw it late, made the adjustment, picked it up, helped spring Damian Harris on that run. Shaq Mason, the right guard, bit more up and down than people are used to. They gave him a big extension a couple years ago. Also, though, an athletic guy, comes from that Georgia Tech background where you're doing a lot of pulling, a lot of movement, and that he was there with the Paul Johnson flex bone, triple option type stuff. So they use him on some of their interior gap and pull plays and those short traps. They'll use him on those. So if you see them running counter short traps on the inside, it's usually Shaq Mason who's going to be leading you to the football. And we talked about Michael Wenu, fantastic, rookie out of Michigan, and he's really done a great job for them. They've basically used him, like I said, pretty much everywhere, but most notably, most often at that right tackle spot, and he's been fantastic.
Yeah, I'm just we'll let the jealousy drop for a second. The wide receiver core probably going to be a pretty short discussion here at this point.
Discussion.
I want to ask you one more thing about alignment. Jermaine Illuminor has been often on the injury report this year, but I think he went actually on IR yesterday, didn't he?
Yeah, he was battling injuries. He was there, he was supposed to be their swing tackle, and you had the Marcus Cannon opt out. And so he sort of became their, right tackle. Now he's on the IR, designated for return, but he's still on that right now. So you won't see him Sunday. Maybe they bring him back, maybe not. A lot of that might depend on how the rest of the season shakes out.
Okay. All right. I'm sorry. So let's go to the wide receivers for the short discussion here.
Yeah, and it's going to be a quick one. Look, Julian Edelman's hurt. N'Keal Harry, he got hurt against San Francisco, and I'm not expecting him back. This has really become a 21 personnel team. Damian Byrd and Jacoby Myers. Myers is the guy that it seems like has the bulk of the targets right now over the past couple of weeks. They'll use him on a lot of in cuts, crossers. They'll dial up some corner routes and some deeper stuff for him, but he's the more diverse route runner of the two. Most of what Damian Byrd does is going to be on that vertical stem. You're going to see hitches, comebacks, curls, and goes. Like that's kind of how they've used those guys. And conceptually, this offense now, they do a lot of 2 and 3 receiver route concepts where, you watch that game Monday night, you watch the all 22. A lot of their plays were just bird on some sort of vertical stem route and then a corner route from, Jacoby Myers, or a dig from Jacoby Myers, and then either a chip and release from the tight end or a chip and release from the fullback. A lot of their stuff
And
is
two set blockers out of the remaining 3, you're saying, with one chip and release?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And they really have done that in the past couple of weeks to really sort of simplify what Cam Newton has to read. And whether that's, a learning curve thing, whether that's how they feel about, what puts them in the best position to be successful, whatever the reason, they're doing a lot more of that in recent weeks, Ken. So, the wide receiver discussion's quick. The tight end discussion might even be quicker, because, Ryan Izzo, he's caught some balls for them, but he's not certainly somebody that's going to keep you up at night. If you're, Wink Martindale, you're wondering about how you're going to defend these guys. You're not worried about Ryan Izzo. They drafted the 2 rookie tight ends. Devin CSC is now on IR. So they used Dalton Keene in the end of that San Francisco game. He's more of your move type tight end, H-back type guy. That's what he was at Virginia Tech, but they haven't relied on him much. I mean, the tight end position has been, since the retirement of Gronkowski, a black hole for this team, and it continues to be a black hole for this team right now.
Okay, so I've got to ask this question that arises naturally from this. You only have 2 wide receivers you can even bring on the field. You only have 1 tight end you use most of the time, and you're a committed 21 personnel team, which means I don't know if there are 3 running backs to choose from. We'll get to that in a minute. But does that provide an opportunity to do more no huddle, or does it put a bigger onus on playing no huddle because no huddle, you always play your same 11. Is Newton running an offense that has a similar pace to what Brady was able to run?
No, I mean, I can't remember, absent sort of 2-minute situations, them using tempo from a strategic standpoint. They are really sort of a traditional grinded out type of team now. And I've used this expression before. It seems like they are trying to build a team to win 17-14 rock fights. Like that's what they're trying to do. The problem is, you don't see a lot of 17-14 rock fights in the 2020 version of the National Football League. It's more of a high-paced, high-scoring league right now. So they're trying to sort of turn back the clock a bit, and 3-5 tells you how it's going.
Well, we've seen some past Ravens years certainly like that, and a lot of years where they're trying to win games exactly like that. So we can at least commiserate with you. In terms of the running backs, obviously Burkhead still a factor. Before we get started, if growing an e-commerce business is your focus, you'll need a platform that's focused on growth. That's where Klaviyo comes in. Klaviyo is the ultimate e-commerce marketing platform for online brands of all kinds and all sizes. Whether you're just getting started or running a well-known brand, it gives you everything you need to send memorable, branded emails, text messages, and more so you can build strong relationships that keep your customers coming back. With flexible automations, powerful insights, and super precise targeting, Klaviyo is a faster way to turn great ideas into great customer experiences. That's why it's trusted by more than 40,000 brands like Living Proof, Huckberry, and 8 Sleep. In fact, on average, Klaviyo customers see a 41% increase in overall revenue within 5 months. Klaviyo scales with you, so you never have to switch. They support everything from garage startups to iconic billion-dollar brands. Want to learn more about how you can grow your brand with Klaviyo? Visit klaviyo.com/grow to get started with a free trial today. That's klaviyo.com/grow. How's White been this year?
White's been up and down. Now, obviously, you had the horrible situation with his parents in a car accident and the passing of his father. So he missed some time as a result of that. And what's been interesting is, I thought that James White might carve out a bigger role with Cam Newton, because I was sort of envisioning a lot of those plays where you've got the outside zone look from the running back, the quarterback meeting him at the mesh point, and maybe he keeps it inside while you get that outside zone action from the running back. And I thought that really would fit what James White was doing. They haven't used him on a lot of that. And then they did Monday night on a 4th down and he fumbled. The receiving part of the game from a running back perspective, isn't quite there in the playbook. There have been moments when they've tried to get James White involved in the downfield passing game, but Newton has missed on some of those throws. He had a miss early in the game against San Francisco on a third down situation to White, where it was a low throw. White had to adjust to it and get stopped. There was a miss on a play against the Jets early in that game, similar situation where the throw was low. So they've used him in screens and things like that, but he hasn't been as big a component of this offense this year as he has been in years past. And really, over the past couple of weeks, Ken, it's been Damian Harris. Now, he got knocked out of the game against New York with a chest injury, and he was one of the 17 players on the injury list that came out today on Wednesday morning. So, maybe he's going to be a good to go on Sunday night. What they like with him is he gives you both. Harris gives you that outside zone game. He gives you that gap and power stuff on the inside. Much more of a decisive runner than Sony Michel. The problem with Sony Michel, and now he's also dealing with injuries, but when he was healthy, was he was much too indecisive on those zone run schemes. And when they lost James Devlin, he seemed very tentative on gap and power stuff, following behind now Jakob Johnson, their current fullback. It seemed like the injury and then the retirement of James Devlin really sort of stunted Sony Michel's development. And so Rex Burkhead and Damian Harris, like those are the two guys they rely on the most right now as their two running backs.
And do they play a fair amount of pony with that then? Because obviously the fullback has not played nearly all the snaps. Do they playing a lot of two-man pony or two halfback?
They've done some pony, Ken, but for the most part, they're using the fullback a lot now in the past couple of weeks. They've worked in some pony. They've done that with both Burkhead and White on the field at the same time. They've done it some, although not as much, with Burkhead and Harris. They're relying on Jakob Johnson, who was an international player. He's caught a couple of passes, but really he's a sixth offensive lineman. Maybe if you want to say a seventh offensive lineman, if you count the tight end as an additional offensive lineman. They do some lead stuff with him, some lead zone with him, some short traps with him as well. But this is a 21 personnel team right now.
So a lot of the embarrassment of riches on offense, aside from the offensive line, which is obviously very good, is at running back. Is there any part of you that looks at how Harris has played this year and said he's been too good to get only the snaps he's got? That he had 28 snaps, I think, against the Jets, and that's the most he had this year. Or are you happy with the spread, and that's part of why it's successful?
I mean, I'd like to see Harris get more because I think he gives them a bit more burst and explosiveness and toughness. He's had some tough runs, but I also understand that, look, Rex Burkhead, they really trust him, and he's a more dangerous weapon in the passing game. And if you want to run screens, if you want to run some designed some designed running back throws, he's the guy that they trust on those. They don't quite trust Harris there. They trust Harris in pass protection. They trust White, obviously, in pass protection. So I do, in a sense, like the spread. I would like to see Harris get more carries. The problem is, who do you take that away from? Mm-hmm. So it is, like you said, the embarrassment of riches. That running back room is a deep room. And when you've got problems with tight end, when you've got problems with wide receiver, in a sense, it's nice to at least have that.
And someone like White or perhaps Harris, do they act at all as a third wide receiver ever? Do they line up outside a fair amount?
You've seen that more from White and Burkhead. They haven't done that with Harris. They've maybe done it like once or twice, but it's really with White or Burkhead where you might see those guys, start out at empty. They love to do that, and they still do that. It's part of what they did with Brady, was to start out at an empty, get a look from the defense, and then bring the running back into the formation. They would typically do that with White. They've done it a couple of times with Burkhead, maybe a smattering of snaps with Harris doing that. So they will still do that to get that sort of pre-snap look from the defense, but they haven't really used it as a weapon. And matter of fact, that Edelman interception I mentioned earlier from that San Francisco game, that was one of the rare moments where they went with that empty look with Burkhead outside to the left, and Burkhead was open, and Newton didn't throw to him, And maybe that's what sort of spelled the death knell for that over the past 2 weeks.
All right. That's some wonderful depth on the offense. Let's move over to the defensive side and talk a little bit about things. Now, the first question I always like to ask is, what's the most common base and then the pass defense look they'll show? So, what do they line up with when a typical 11 personnel is shown? And I guess with the Ravens, it's more typically either 12 or 21 personnel on first down, and a pass defense look they'd show against, say, 11 personnel on third down.
Well, Ken, I wish I could tell you a definitive answer because they're still trying to figure that out. And what I mean by that is this, from charting them just the past couple of weeks, okay? Against San Francisco, obviously a very heavy 21 personnel team. Juszczyk, Kittle, you understand that. They had 52 plays where they went with 4 defensive linemen with a lot of 4-3 to that. They had 16 plays where they went with 3 defensive linemen, primarily 3-2-6, but with some 3-1-7 mixed into that.
Wow.
But then last week, Monday night against the Jets, they had 32 snaps, Ken, where they were in a 5-1-5. Now, part of that might have been, they had some injuries, particularly linebacker. Juwan Bentley was out. So they were trying to piece things together. But that's just the past 2 weeks. They've been sub at times. There were a lot of times where they were, a 4-2-5, 3-2-6 kind of team. But then against the Jets, and this wasn't just on third and short situations. I'm talking, they came out, you're in 11, we're in 5-1-5.
Okay.
You're in 12, we're in 5-1-5.
I need to do just a little translation for my typical audience here. That's the defense I label as jumbo nickel. So you have 1 inside linebacker, you have 2 outside linebackers on the field, and 3 down linemen. That's really what 5-1-5 means to you?
Well, the 5-1-5 package they were using, they had 2 defensive ends as the outside guys in that 5-man front. So you've got 3 down linemen, 2 defensive ends.
Standing.
Yep.
Okay, so might have some definitional difference there in terms of where we're starting from, but I think we're basically in the same spot. But you mentioned then they play a lot of actual dime personnel where they have a third safety or a fourth corner.
That varies who that 6th, the defensive back is, but for the most part, they like a lot of 3 safety packages. So you will see a lot of Adrian Phillips, Terrence Brooks, and Devin McCourty, or Adrian Phillips, Devin McCourty, and then either a Kyle Duggar or Jawan Williams, who they've used as a safety this year. So they really think that the strength of this defense still is in the secondary. Mm-hmm. And so they will throw numbers at you, whether it's 5, whether it's 6, whether it's 7 defensive backs. And, that 3-2-6 sort of sub-package is something that they've used a lot over the Belichick run in the recent history. I mean, you look back, some of those games against the Kansas City Chiefs, 3rd and 1, first and goal from the 3, they're out there at a 3-2-6 package, basically daring you to run the ball. Now, when you start to think about what they're going to do against the Ravens on Sunday night, you look back at last year. Last year, they did a lot of 3-3-5, 3-5-3 even. They really started last year's game in a base 3-4. That's how they came out to start of the game last year. And then that didn't work on the opening drive. And that's when they went to a 3-5-3 with 5 linebackers on the field. And that certainly didn't work. So might we see this sort of 5-man front that they used last week against the Jets? Perhaps. But a lot of it might depend on who's healthy for them. Because in that sort of, 1 linebacker package, the 1 linebacker was Terez Hall, who's basically, a depth guy for them. Mm-hmm. So they're figuring it out. They don't really have like a base a base front that they'll just say, look, this is our bread and butter. Like whatever you're in, we're going to run 3-4, we're going to run 4-3, we're going to run 4-2-5. They're figuring that part out.
Okay. And who's their safety? Who's the best run fit guy who would be helping in I'll call it a 5-1-5 package or a jumbo nickel?
Yeah. It's Adrian Phillips, who they signed from the Chargers this offseason. Yeah, they've used him, Ken, as sort of that hybrid. You see that a lot now where teams have that sort of hybrid type joker type safety that you'll bring down in the box, sort of that Patrick Chung role. When they had Patrick Chung, they would go a lot with that sort of 3-2-6, but they could turn that into that, 4-man front on the fly, or even a 5-man front on the fly, and then bring Patrick Chung down to play linebacker. That's how you use an Adrian Phillips. He's the guy that's going to be down in the box. He might be the guy that, on third downs might get tasked with spying Lamar Jackson, or he might get tasked with sort of putting his nose on the football. If you're going to run that sort of scrape exchange stuff where you're going to sell out, make the quarterback keep it on that zone read, he'll be the guy scraping to the outside. So Adrian Phillips would be the guy sort of in that role.
Okay, so the Ravens fans will remember Adrian Phillips. He was part of the 7 DB group that basically beat the Ravens in the 2018 playoff game. Yep. So that hurts still.
Yeah.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about rotation, depth, and snap management. Usually when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about the defensive line where the rotation is really paramount. Do they have enough bodies there right now to get the rotation you would like?
No, they don't. And part of that was, with Lawrence Guy's injury, if you're talking about a guy that's sort of, I don't want to say cornerstone type player, but, probably the most dependable up front, it's Lawrence Guy. He's been out battling injuries. Brian Cowart, another Maryland guy, he's flashed at times. They used Nick Thurman last week and the week before that, another undrafted type of player. They've really sort of relied on John Simon at one defensive end and then pieced it together on the other side. Chase Winovich, who was a third-round pick for them last year, his snap counts really dropped over the previous 2 weeks. They kicked up a notch last week. They used him more, due in part to some of these injuries. Showed a couple of plays where, he could help against the run. He could give you a little bit of pass rush. But the rotational aspect to it, it's not where they'd like it to be. It's not where I'd like it to be. It's a really thin group. I think that, absent the quarterback position, that's an area I think they have to make some investments in this offseason with the cap space that they have and the draft capital that they have. They need to get something from Anthony Jennings. They've started to work him into the lineup a bit. I'd like to see them use him more, Alabama player that they got in the 3rd round. I'd like to see them use him in a bit of that rotation. You could use him at inside linebacker. You could drop him down to the edge. I'd like to see him get some more snaps. Adam Butler has been in and out of the lineup. He's a player that I think could give them a bit more, but he hasn't quite lived up to it. So, yeah, Ken, this defensive line, defensive front, it's not as deep as I'd like it to be. The rotation isn't enough. And particularly, look, when you start thinking about Sunday night and you see when the Ravens went to that sort of a bit of tempo in the second half that seemed to jumpstart that offense a bit, that's a concern for me, because if that defensive front gets worn down, especially if Greg Roman starts using that tempo to wear those guys down up front, that could spell doom for this Patriots defense on Sunday night.
I think that'll be a priority, is winning snap count and seeing if that can be done. Obviously, have they been activating a number on game day that is extra at that position? Like, one of the things the Ravens have been doing that's just driving me nuts is they'll frequently activate only 4 defensive linemen, which they don't use a lot of defensive linemen per play because they use a lot of outside linebackers at the line of scrimmage and pass rush downs. But I still hate it. It's too much risk.
Yeah, I mean, they've been usually you see like 2 or 3 guys on the defensive front at the start of the year would be inactive, and you'd be like, okay, well, that makes sense. They trust their secondary. They trust their linebackers. Monday night against the Jets, it was just Guy who was inactive. They basically threw all the bodies they had at it, and they still couldn't get it right. Now, maybe that was a game plan specific thing. Like I said, with that 5-man front, however you're defining that, with the defensive ends and stuff mixed in, maybe they're like, look, this is what we're going to do, because of the injuries we have. Jawan Bentley's banged up. We're very thin at linebacker, so we're going to solve the problem with bodies up front. And if they get, some of the linebackers back this week, like Jawan Bentley, then maybe it changes. But yeah, they just threw numbers at the problem against the Jets. And the Jets and Frank Gore were still running the ball all over.
Anyway, that's obviously a problem that has come up from time to time. But the Ravens, very fortunately, even when they've had the problem, they've been able to go to the street and get the guys. And I guess one of the questions I would have is, I think the Mata Pecco is still out there right now.
Yeah.
And there'd be other players too, but Pecco was a godsend for the Ravens defensive line last year when they brought him in.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are bodies out there to be had. I mean, you look at some of the moves that have been made in the past couple of weeks. I mean, Yannick Ngakoue is suddenly a Baltimore Raven. I mean, there were moves that teams could have made. Patriots haven't made any of them. And maybe that points to the we're trying to set ourselves up for 2021 more than anything else kind of answer, maybe there is something to that.
Like part of that, if they're really trying to set themselves up for 2021, if that was the only consideration, then they'd have taken less for Gilmore and moved him. And I have heard the argument said that there wasn't enough draft capital out there among the buyers to create a deal for Gilmore, and that what that speaks to is you just got to take less when the market demands it. But the Patriots are in a good position because they really can wait on a good deal to come, given the amount of cap space they have relative to other teams. They're going to pick the bones of other teams in the free agency this coming year.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Ken, that's exactly right. They're looking at, if we don't get what we want for Stephon Gilmore, okay, we'll live with it because we have cap space. And, there are going to be guys available. There are going to be players available that we will be satisfied with. And that's one thing that they've always done pretty well. They're not 100%, no team is, but they've done pretty well in free agent, particularly that secondary free agent market where, we'll let you overpay for Trey Flowers and sign him away from us. That's fine.
You'll get Lawrence Guy.
We'll get Lawrence Guy. Yeah. We'll get, Kyle Van Noy. We'll get a Jamie Collins again. We'll nibble around day 2 and day 3 of free agency when everybody's spent all their money. That's when we're going to swoop in, and they'll do more of that, I'd imagine, in this upcoming offseason.
There's going to be lots of value there. I mean, I think a lot of players will get released, and there'll be a lot of players who are trying to sign cheap deals with their current team, and that's where the Patriots can sweep in and Belichick can work his magic and get them.
Yeah.
All right. I know there's not much at linebacker. Let's talk about it a little bit in terms of what platooning they've done there. I guess most of it is with safeties, but talk a little bit about the inside linebacker core.
When they drafted Juwan Bentley out of Purdue, he was a 5th-round pick in 2018. There were a lot of people, and I would put myself in this category, that said, he's a dinosaur, he's a throwback, he's a 2-down thumper. And then in that sort of preseason, he showed you some coverage skills where you thought, maybe there's more to that. Maybe the Patriots got this right. It seems like now that we're seeing him thrust into that full-time role, he's a 2-down thumper. He can stop the run. He's very technically sound from a run fit perspective. I don't know run fits 100%, but I know when they're done right, and he does them right. So he can be a critical part of their game plan, I would say, on Sunday night. Outside of that, though, if you want to look at opt-outs and you want to look at what happened this past offseason, there was no position group that got hurt more than the linebacker room because they lost Kyle Van Noy. They lost Jamie Collins. They lost to Landon Roberts. And now you have Dante Hightower opting out. When I mentioned earlier that they played with a 5-man linebacker package against the Ravens last year, there's 4 of them. And the only one that's still here is Juwan Bentley. They've tried to piece it together with Jennings. They've used Adrian Phillips and Terrence Brooks, another safety, as pseudo linebackers. But it's a weakness now. It's a weakness. And there's a lack of athleticism at the second level, which when you try to replace that with safety types like Phillips and Brooks and at times Kyle Duggar, maybe you've got some athleticism. But then when you've got teams that can run downhill and can get guards up to the second level, you're going to be outmanned at that point. And so there are opportunities when they go with this light package. And, if you watch Monday night's game, Louis Riddick was talking about it, Brian Greasy was talking about it. When you're, 5-1-5, 3-2-6, and you start getting those guys flowing to the second level, now you've got guards on safeties. That's a recipe for disaster, trying to stop the run. And so now looking ahead to Baltimore, that's going to keep, Steve Belichick, Bill Belichick up at night. How are we going to stop the run if we're outmanned at the second level?
Yeah, that'll be interesting. I'm predicting a big game out of Miles Boykin here as a run blocker. I hope he'll get some targets as well because we all do hope that eventually works out. But he's been a terrific run blocker. And, having a wide receiver who can do that, having a tight end who can line up in the backfield and throw a block for you. Mark Andrews, I don't think of him as being a particularly good blocker. And he's mostly a split receiver when he's on the field. But he lined up, in a tight formation and made an unbelievable block on the 9-yard TD run by Jackson this last week. So you probably saw the highlight of that. So
yep.
I think that's where the Ravens can make a defense that tries to play small look bad. They didn't do it in that 2018 playoff game, but they have the matchups they want now, I think, to use skill position players to make blocks there.
Yeah. And that's certainly a concern because they don't have the personnel, Ken, to try that, even if just a base 3-4 right now, they don't have the personnel to do that. So if they're going to have to, try to fill in the gaps with the safeties, that's a problem.
All right. The defensive backfield, why don't you take us through once from, across the umbrella there?
Yeah, I mean, at one cornerback spot, you've basically got Jason McCourty, a savvy veteran type player, not a supreme athlete. If there are situations where you've got him, matched up against some of the Ravens' speed, that's not a good position for the Patriots to be in. Obviously, we know what Stephon Gilmore can do. Very talented, trusted cornerback for Bill Belichick. Somebody that Belichick will put on George Kittle one week, will put on a Miles Boykin or a Hollywood Brown the next week, or they might put on Zach Ertz the week after that. Basically, Gilmore's the guy that if he's healthy, Belichick could have put him on your best player and say, look, that's your guy. I'll see you next week. I'm not worried. But he's got the knee injury. And so we don't know if he was limited again today on Wednesday. So we don't know if he's going to go. J.C. Jackson, another solid corner, might be a CB1 in some other teams. Has a short-term memory. We saw that Monday night.
Oh, yeah.
Got beat a couple of times, had the big interception. He's got great recovery skills. He had a breakup on the Jets' first drive where he got beat on a double move type play, but recovered. Technically sound at the catch point, does a great job at sort of coming up through the pocket, how the Patriots teach it. There's a great coaching clinic when Matt Patricia was with New England. He gave a presentation at Notre Dame. You can find it on YouTube. It's like an hour long on defensive breakdowns and film study and coaching techniques. But at like the 32-minute mark, he talks about coming up through the pocket, how they teach their defensive backs. And you saw it on that play. So those guys can cover. They can cover well. Devin McCourty is as solid as it gets as a free safety in the National Football League, but obviously somebody with a cornerback's background. They can use him in coverage situations. They have used him at times on guys like Travis Kelce to play more man coverage with him. But this year, because of some of the lack of depth at the safety spot, they've really used him more as a free safety type. Kyle Duggar, like I said, they hoped he would be sort of a spot snap guy, special teamer this year, but he's had to play a little bit more. They've used him in some half-field roles at times. They've never really trusted him as a middle-of-the-field post safety, mostly down to the box. Used him on tight ends at times. Same with Jawan Williams. He was a corner at Vanderbilt, but they've tried to use him more as a safety, tight end type of guy. Jonathan Jones, I didn't mention him in the corners, but very, he's probably their best athlete of the corners. He's somebody that when they play like a Tyreek Hill, he will get that assignment with some dedicated safety help over the top. A good way to think about how they view their corner situation is, Gilmore would get Sammy Watkins. They'd take Jones and they'd leave him on an island. Jonathan Jones would get Tyreek Hill with some safety help. And then J.C. Jackson would get McCole Hardman. Then again, with perhaps some safety help, and they'd play more two high shells. And then you got, Terrence Brooks, Adrian Phillips. Those are your hybrid joker type players where, yes, they're safeties on the score sheet and on the lineup, but they're really used out of the box, more of your safety linebackers type hybrid type players.
So they really only trust them as a dime backer as opposed to as a deep, even half field safety.
Yeah, for the most part, Belichick believes cover one is God's coverage. That's what, if he could play cover one on every single snap, that's what he would do. And so, yeah, you'd see those guys down to the box. Now this year, against, for example, Kansas City, you saw a lot more cover two, cover four at times, playing some zone coverage techniques. A couple of times against Seattle, they tried to do some cover three to keep eyes on Russell Wilson. They got a pick six with that, but then the zone coverage started to carve them up a little bit. Then that's when they went to man, and you saw a wheel route touchdown against Adrian Phillips, where he got beat on a wheel route by the running back out of the backfield. And so, like with everything else this year, Ken, they're trying to figure it out, and they haven't solved those questions yet. They haven't solved those riddles yet. And now we're here in the 9th game of the season, and you're still trying to figure it out. That's never a good thing for a team.
It still sounds, honestly, and you going through this group and me, pondering the cornerbacks they have, the cornerback group is still very strong in terms of, the numbers of quality players you have and what you can depend on there. McCourty might be the weakest of the group at this point, Jason.
Yeah, he might be. The issue is, in years past, one of the things that I think we're starting to see about just football conceptually is safe cornerback play, safety play, coverage play in general can be a bit high variance. In years past, like last year, for example, 2018, before that, this secondary was so good that the lack of a pass rush didn't matter. That even if you had as an opposing quarterback 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds to throw, there weren't going to be breakdowns in the secondary of the New England Patriots. This year, there have been breakdowns. There have been, the exchange rules and the switch rules against bunches, for example. You're seeing breakdowns in those moments. The 49ers had a single two-man stack, run a switch vertical out of it. Both guys cover the hitch. Nobody covers the wheel, and you get an easy throw. These are the breakdowns we're seeing now from this defense that we haven't seen in years past. Now, whether that's a lack of training camp, a lack of preseason, whatever the reason, excuses don't matter. They're not getting it done. And maybe it's veterans making mistakes. Maybe it's newer players making mistakes. Maybe it's a rookie making a mistake, but the mistakes are being made. And when you combine that with the fact that they still can't get that pass rush, that's a problem. And so that's what we're seeing right now. The talent is certainly there. Look, I walked you through it. The secondary is talented, but the combination isn't right. And they're making mental mistakes, which is what you don't typically associate with a Bill Belichick coach defense.
All right. I mean, I know there have certainly been issues at linebacker and whatnot in terms of coverage, but the team as a whole has 12 touchdown passes allowed and 10 interceptions. That's exactly what you want. I mean, it's exactly what you want.
Yeah. And 5 of those touchdowns came against Seattle. I mean, so, they've been good. The problem is for this team as a whole right now, the margin for error is slim. This is not an offense that can really throw you back into a game. So as a defense, you have to be close to perfect. And when you're not, and you get down 23-3 like they did against San Francisco, 18-3 like you did against Denver, you're in trouble as an offense. Now, in the Denver game, the defense stepped up, 2 interceptions in the fourth quarter of Drew Lock, gave him a chance to get back in the game. That didn't happen against San Francisco. And then before you know it, Jarrett Stidham's in the game and Cam Newton has a towel over his head, and you're wondering about his future in New England. So the margin for error is razor thin right now with this team. And even as talented as this defense has been, and the numbers they put up have been good, they almost have to be perfect, and that's asking a lot.
All right. Outstanding stuff. So much depth. I really appreciate this, Mark. Give us one player you think matches up well against the Ravens. I don't think there's any need for score predictions, but who's the one player? Last year it was Tom Brady you picked.
Yeah, and we don't have Tom Brady, so I can't make that pick again. As much as I'd love to, because he might still be the best answer if he were on this team. But, interestingly enough, I do think that they have something in Jacoby Myers. From his understanding of leverage, from his understanding of concepts, from his understanding of what a quarterback is looking for, given his experience at the position. I think they hit on a little diamond in the rough here. And, if you're approaching this Patriots offense as a defensive coordinator, I think you might play some zone stuff. I know that's not where the Ravens like to be, similar to Bill Belichick. They like to play a bit more man to keep eyes on the quarterback. That gives Myers the opportunity to find some soft spots in that. And so I think given those reasons, Jacoby Myers might be the guy I feel most comfortable about. I won't even say confident. I'd say most comfortable about heading into Sunday night.
All right. That'll be interesting because the Ravens will be back with Humphrey. Presumably they'll be playing a lot of base defense if it's a lot of 21 looks, which means it'll be Humphrey and Peters on opposite sides. And I don't think they'll even switch. I mean, I think that Peters is too comfortable with at left cornerback and knowing where the sideline is and the shoulder he likes to catch over and whatnot. Anyway, great material here. Let's tell people where they can find your work, your Twitter handle, anything else you want to plug right now.
Well, Ken, as always, thanks so much for having me. I love these shows. They're fantastic. You can find me on Twitter at Mark Schofield, like you mentioned, USA Today's Touchdown Wire. I also host the Sco Show, which is a Patriots podcast on SB Nation's Pat's Pulpit, but on Twitter at Mark Schofield.
Go ahead, Josh.
All right, great. And don't forget my bookie. I just looked it up. Ravens are 7.5-point favorites on my bookie going into this weekend. The Masters starts tomorrow, I believe. So there's betting there if you want to get in on the golf game on my bookie, plus all the college football this weekend. So make sure you sign up over at my bookie, and when you do, use our promo code RAVENS. to claim a deposit match dollar for dollar all the way up to $1,000.
Incredible match there. I hope people are taking advantage of that, because that's $1,000 free dollars as I would look at it. Even though there is a rollover requirement, you have to use it a couple times. That's an awful nice matching bonus there, and it's a not insignificant amount of money. Let me ask you one question. I'm not a golf fan at all, but I did see the video of the guy who skimmed the ball across. What did you think of that, Mark?
First of all, I love the sort of Masters par 3 and all the stuff they do in the lead up to it. And I love how they approach that hole each week. Everybody tries to do that. That's one of those things that every golfer, sort of tries in the Masters practice rounds and the par 3. That was incredible. I mean, because the way the video is shot, once the ball comes up onto the green, you're like, oh, wow, it must just roll straight in. But it has to then bend and turn and make this like 90-degree left turn to go like 100 yards of carry to the hole. I mean, just absolutely incredible. It's one of those moments, when we cover football, there are times we'll be reminded like these players are just superhuman people. Like, I go down to the Senior Bowl and I walk into the lobby at the Renaissance where all the players, that's like the headquarters for the Senior Bowl. And you walk into the lobby, and I remember it was Brian O'Neill, who at the time, was coming out of the University of Pittsburgh, left tackle. Now he's on the Vikings. And he's just a mammoth human being. And I'm 5'9", and I'm like looking up 2 feet to the sky to see this guy's head. These are superhumans. And it's the same thing with golf. Like, say what you want about golf as a sport or not, the fact that you could get a golf ball to do that when you're basically hitting it wrong and still do that, it's just absurd. It's just absurd.
It's certainly a crazy video worth going out and looking on Twitter for.
Definitely.
All right, rest of the week, we've got some things coming. We've got By the Numbers. We'll be out there on Friday morning. Look for the offensive line article. That'll be out there right around the same time this is coming out. So if you're looking at the Know Your Foe, you can also go find the offensive line scoring from this last week. Regular stuff coming up after the Patriots game in terms of the defensive article, the offensive article, and the podcasts to go with that. Josh, anything else?
No, you covered it all. We're good. We will talk again soon.